Hey everyone, here is our third video about genetics, and we are going to talk about pedigrees and inheritance patterns here. There are going to be 6 patterns that we talk about, and we'll talk about what pedigrees are. So, I want you to know that a pedigree is a tool that geneticists will use to trace the inheritance of traits over many generations of a family, and it's called a pedigree. So, the pedigrees are basically kind of like a family tree of the genetic conditions within a family. So pedigrees, you can see a lot of different types of symbols there. A circle is for a female, someone who's genetically female. A square is for somebody who is genetically male. A darkened shape, if it's a circle or a square, is going to be somebody who is affected with a trait or has a certain trait. If they have a line through them, they have passed away, they are deceased. If they have this kind of shape, this triangle shape ish, they're twins. If they have brackets around them, they are adopted. And if it's a triangle, that means the child was miscarried. So there was a miscarriage. That could indicate that there was a genetic condition that would not allow that child to survive. Um, when you see pedigrees, if it's a line between two people, directly between two people, it is a marriage or not necessarily a marriage, but it just means that they had offspring together. A line that goes downwards means that children were made. And this line that is above anybody means that these two people would actually be siblings. And we use Roman numerals to mark the generations. So, like generation one and generation two. Here is an example of a pedigree. This is a pedigree that shows the inheritance of freckles within a family. The allele for freckles, big F, is actually dominant to the allele for having no freckles, which would be little f. So this is a pedigree of a dominant trait and how it is passed on over a family. And you can see individual 1, number 2. So Roman numeral 1, number 2. This is like the grandmother of a family, and she has freckles. This square, because you'll remember that circles are female genetically and squares are male. This square is person 1, because generation 1, number 1. He is a male who does not have freckles. Well, these two get together and they have 4 children or 3 children. They have 3 children. They have this child, and this child. So person number 2 is their child. Person number 3 is their child, and person number 5 is their child, because those are people who all came from this line of descent. And out of the children between these two, actually 2 out of 3 of their children have freckles, and 1 out of the 3 does not have freckles. Those children each decide to have children with other people. And so you can see this line that means that they had children together, they had children together, and they had children together. Now, these two are parents who did not have freckles, and their children did not have freckles either, because these guys were actually homozygous recessive. They had little f, and little f, little f. That means the only thing that could be passed to their children was little f. So if a freckly child had showed up here, maybe it's not the right father. But anyway, over here we have a father with freckles and a mother with no freckles, and they have children who both happen to have freckles because they got that freckle trait from their dad. They must have both inherited a big F allele from their dad. Over here, we have a mother who has freckles and a father who does not have freckles. This mother is most likely has the genotype of big F, little f, because she got a big F from her mom and a little f from her dad. So she carries the trait for not having freckles, but she actually does have freckles. And then this guy that she has a kid with, he's little f because he has no freckles, and that's the recessive trait, would be having no freckles. So they get together and they have 2 kids, and one of their kids has freckles. So they must have gotten a big F from their mom and a little f from their dad. And then this child did not have freckles, which means they must have gotten a little f from their mom and a little f from their dad. So you can see that's how pedigrees work. Next, let's talk about these different traits and how they get inherited. There's different types of patterns of how genes get inherited from one generation to the next. So one pattern is called autosomal dominant, and you just saw that in the freckles example. Freckles was dominant to no freckles, and you can see in this pedigree, there were there was at least one person with freckles in every single generation. So autosomal dominant traits, one mutated copy of the gene in each cell is sufficient for a person to be affected by a gene. If it's an autosomal disorder, a lot of times it will not skip generations, and they usually would inherit the genetic disease from a parent who also has that same genetic disease. But it doesn't always have to be a disease. It could just be a trait like freckles. But you can see affected people in this pedigree are red, and it does not skip any generations. All right, an example of that is Huntington's disease. And Huntington's disease does cause problems with the brains, behavior, movement is impaired. A lot of people with Huntington's will end up in a wheelchair and need a lot of assistance later in life. But the unfortunate thing is that you don't know that you have Huntington's disease until age 35 to age 60. So you might have already had children and passed that dominant allele on to your children, and it is fairly likely that your child would have Huntington's disease if you do. So just something to think about there. A lot of people do end up getting genetic testing if they find out that they have a autosomal dominant allele in their family, or that other people in their family have had diseases like Huntington's. They might get tested prior to having children to avoid passing that trait, because this is a particular trait that makes life very challenging for the patients. Next up, I have autosomal recessive. So you would need both copies of a gene to have the mutation that would have an autosomal recessive pattern of inheritance. And these disorders are not seen every generation in a family. So it usually skips a generation, like a grandparent might have it and a grandchild might have it. And nobody in this generation had it because it skipped the generation. It's kind of like in the first video, how the parents had one smooth and one wrinkly pea, and then their offspring had both smooth peas, and then their grandchildren offspring would have had also a chance of having wrinkly peas. It's because it could skip a generation. So if you have a trait in your family that skips a generation, a lot of times it's because it's an autosomal recessive trait, because you would have to have homozygous recessive alleles in order to have that trait. So you can see cystic fibrosis is actually an example of that. Sometimes parents will have a child who has cystic fibrosis, and neither of the parents had cystic fibrosis, but maybe a grandparent or some other relative in an earlier generation might have had cystic fibrosis too. Next up, I have sex-linked traits. Sex-linked traits are traits that are on the X chromosome or on the Y chromosome. And we talked about before in our Punnett square videos how males are more likely to inherit an X-linked recessive disorder. And with Y-linked disorders, only males can get it because only males have a Y chromosome. So if you look at this pedigree, you can see that mostly anybody who has it is a male or has a square shape, and that the actual trait would have been passed on from their mother to them. And you could see that there with that little M gets passed to the son, and he has the condition. His mom was a carrier. His grandfather had the condition. But typically with X-linked disorders, it could skip a generation, and it will pretty much only affect males. Very occasionally would affect females. An example of that is Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and that causes weakness in the muscles, and the nerve tissues do not communicate properly with the muscle cells. And so you end up losing muscle, and you can oftentimes end up in a wheelchair. There are problems with your heart and your diaphragm that helps you breathe, and possibly also brain development challenges. So unfortunately, most people do not survive having Duchenne muscular dystrophy, but typically anybody who has Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a boy who got that gene from his mother. Another example of that is hemophilia. This is in the royal houses of Europe. A lot of times royal families actually do have some incest within them, which results in the children having more genetic conditions, and hemophilia is an example of that. This is the family of Anastasia. So you have heard maybe of the movie Anastasia, but in her family, there were a lot of males who had hemophilia, which is a condition that causes them to bleed a lot if they get hurt. You can see in this pedigree that many females are actually carriers of it, and then the males, they end up actually having the genetic condition of hemophilia. So hemophilia is a X-linked recessive disorder that mostly appears in males, but the females would be the carriers, and they're the ones who actually pass that hemophilia gene on to their sons. All right, next we have kind of weird examples. So these are all non-Mendelian. They don't follow Gregor Mendel's rules that we've been talking about this whole time. And one of them is called incomplete dominance. And it is when you get a blend of phenotypes for the homozygous, for the heterozygous offspring of two homozygous parents. So in this case, you have flowers like carnations. This parent is dominant for red. This parent is dominant for white. And their offspring ends up being a combination of that, which is pink. It also happens in chickens. You can have a black chicken and a white chicken, and they have a gray or blue offspring. And that's because both alleles are actually kind of dominant, but when you put them together, you get a blend. Over here, we have multiple alleles. This is when you actually have more than two alleles that could code for the same gene. And a big example of that is blood types. So you might have heard of type A blood, type B blood, type AB blood, and type O. It's because there's actually multiple alleles. There's an A type of allele, which is with the little I and an A. There's a B type, which is with the little I and a B. There's also just having little I with no A or B attached, and that would be type O blood. And so with something with multiple alleles, you can end up with many different types of phenotypes rather than just two types. So that's kind of interesting. And then finally, polygenic inheritance is also not following Mendel's rules, but it is a trait that is controlled by many different genes. And each little gene makes a small contribution to the overall appearance of the person or the person's overall phenotype. And an example is skin color. Like we don't have just two skin colors. It's not like you either have pale skin or very, very dark skin. There are people of all different types of skin tones between the palest people and the people with the darkest skin. And the reason for that is that skin tone is controlled by many different genes, and that is called polygenic inheritance. And that's how you can end up with people who have all different types of skin tones, and not just only people who have very pale skin and only people who have very dark skin. Thanks for listening. This has been our whole unit about genetics. And if you want to see a summary of all the information, it is here on this slide. And I will also link a video where I discuss this slide to the optional learning opportunities for this week. So if you want to see that as a summary of everything you've learned in the past 3 videos, you may go check that out. And if not, if you're good to go, then wonderful. If you have questions, please reach out to me. I'm happy to email or Zoom with you.